had a meeting last September called Averting Systemic Collapse. And I think a lot of our members sort of rolled their eyes and thought this was a very dramatic title. And, it's so not in keeping with the OECD, which assumes that an economy is more or less stable and stationary and linear. And, these guys talking about the end of the world, it's like, this is crazy talk. So it was quite interesting when the systemic collapse did come in March of this year, where you had the collapse of whole sets of human-based systems, that it didn't seem so radical after all. But why did we choose this topic, and why do we think systemic collapse is so important? Well, it's basically because we have these threats that I was talking about, all these threats that face our modern societies. And our societies are very interconnected and very complex. And there's also sort of networks of firms and producers, and they operate in a very complex environment of rules and standards and regulations. And so this is very complex. And the thing we know about complex systems is that they fail all the time. But the thing is, for policymakers, there's no point in looking for a trigger to what could set off that collapse. So the trigger could be a pandemic, it could be geopolitical tension, it could be a natural disaster, it could be a financial crisis. And that could set off this cascading failure and collapse. But we really should not worry so much about the triggers, because it could be anything and it could emerge anywhere. A pandemic could emerge from China or from Africa or anywhere, and it can spread globally almost instantly. I mean, who knew that there were direct flights from Wuhan to the United States? So our world is very much interconnected and fragile. And because we have an economic system that's based on optimization, we've been trying to essentially grind out another unit of growth. And what natural scientists tell us is that when you try to optimize complex systems, you make them unstable. So in trying to generate economic growth, we might actually be causing the very problems that we then have to respond to. And that might ultimately feed back and undermine economic growth. So everything's very fragile. The interconnection is just one aspect, but that's then reinforced by the fact that we do have very high inequalities, we do have climate change, and we have all these systemic vulnerabilities that exist. So the main point is that we have a global economy that is extremely fragile, and our policy actions to try and generate economic growth have probably made it more unstable. And we've organized it in this way. So can these systems collapse? Of course they can. And we've seen examples of where there've been partial collapses. We were very close to seeing a much more dramatic collapse of the global economy than we've seen because of COVID. And the reason why we haven't seen such a collapse is because the state really stepped in to bolster and reinforce the financial markets, to essentially keep the economy ticking over, and to have social buy-in to measures that in normal times would have been considered unthinkable. So we do have a fragile set of arrangements. And, if we think about the United States and we think about an economic model, I think the economic model that we have and modern capitalism probably makes a lot of these systemic threats worse than they are. So that's an issue. The one thing about collapse is it doesn't mean that everything will stop. It just means that the system will break down, and then the system will reorganize and find a new way of operating. But what a paleontologist told us about looking at the fossil record, he said that collapse in the record, they can happen very quickly, which for a geologist can be over tens of thousands of years. But it takes a long time to recover. The recovery can take place over hundreds of thousands of years or millions of years when it comes to biodiversity and recovery of these natural systems. And it's the same with these economic systems. I think they can collapse very quickly, and it might take a long time for them to be reconstituted, reordered, and rebuilt. So we should be thinking about how we can reinforce and make these systems more resilient. And I think that's to do with not just preparing and planning for these shocks, but also building the systems in such a way that they can absorb these shocks when they do occur. Then they can adapt and they can rebound, not just bounce back, but bounce forward. So these are the ideas of resilience that we need to start to build in. So I don't like to think about any particular nation state collapsing, because I think we're all so interconnected now that, you know, if a systemically important country collapses, that's not going to be confined. That's going to have an impact on all countries in a very significant way. And it's true, too, that the big systemic crises that we face are global in nature. So they're not going to be concentrated or confined to one region or one country. The greenhouse, the climate change issue is a global issue. And the fact that the country with the largest emissions is not taking it very seriously is a problem which will visit it and the rest of the world. So that's the nature of collapse. Collapse, it's not going to be the collapse of one country because, or one part of a system or one subsystem. All of these subsystems are interconnected to a whole range of other systems. So if one goes down, they will cascade and will cause others to fail. Many of our human-made systems are essentially built to fail because we built them for efficiency. So we built them to not have any redundancy or spare capacity. We've actually built them to be always at the point of collapse. So it's not a system which is likely to be very resilient. And that's by design. Again, these are human systems. We've constructed them in a way which are based on a very small set of principles, of which efficiency has often been the most important one. Just the other thing about that is, although efficient systems are very fragile, it's not that simple. You know, just let's replace all our efficient systems with more resilient systems. If we take Japan, for example, Japan has weathered the storm of COVID very well, and its healthcare system has really stood up to the challenge of the crisis. So it had a resilient healthcare system. But then the question for a policymaker is, does Japan's better performance during COVID compensate for decades of inefficiency of its healthcare system? It's not very obvious. And so some of these trade-offs are very difficult because it's very hard to say to a company that they should have lots of inventory and spare capacity waiting around just in case. And it's not the way we've designed things at all. But I think for certain sensitive products, we do need to have more inventories. And, you know, to deal with pandemics, we need a sort of medical national guard. We do need stockpiles of certain medical equipment. We do need to have the capacity to ramp up production of vaccines. So there are examples where we probably do need resilient systems. And then there are probably a lot of other systems that they're fine if they're efficient, and if they fail, we should be able to reorganize them. But, you know, if people don't get their iPhone, it's a very different proposition than if they don't get a vaccine during a pandemic. Accumulation and consumption have been central tenets of Western society. And now that's creeping into other societies too, that we should have the freedom to be able to consume as much as we can, whenever we want. And there should be no constraints other than our income and the means that we have. So that's the idea. As we've talked about, the problem with the system is that certain firms and certain individuals have been able to accumulate most of the benefits of the system. It's not that they've been equally shared out. So it's the accumulation problem that is really at the heart of a lot of the problems we have. And, if you look at taxes on wealth and taxes on income, taxes on income on the top incomes has reduced a lot, because the idea was that people with very high incomes, they would of course reinvest their money, so the benefits of their wealth will trickle down to the rest of society. So perhaps you shouldn't tax that, and it creates disincentive effects and so forth. So we've been reducing taxes on the wealthy, and that did put a brake on this accumulation problem. And if you look at growth in the 1950s and 60s, it was pretty inclusive. The benefits of growth were widely shared in Europe and in the United States. And now it's not so. Now it's the capitalist system we have now has generated dysfunction. So that begs the question, well, what's different about capitalism now than in the past? And it's partly about the type of tax system that we have. We basically thought that maybe you should tax corporations a lot lower than workers, because corporations create jobs. And so that balance was lost. We've also tried to create all sorts of incentives in economies. So again, wage suppression and getting rid of unions and things like that. All of these things have been motivated by essentially a version of capitalism. And I think where we're moving to is that we probably need to think less of, for example, maximizing shareholder value, which was a principle of corporate behavior. The idea being that companies have an obligation to maximize the benefit for their owners, which are the shareholders. And how do you do that? Well, you can do that by cutting costs, cutting workers, moving production to a lower wage economy. And that's now being replaced in some circles by what we call stakeholder capitalism. That in fact, corporate boards should represent not just the interests of shareholders, but also the interests of workers, the interests of their communities, and the interests of society as a whole. Because firms don't exist just to generate benefits for their management and their owners. Firms are supposed to generate a lot of societal benefits. And if firms are polluting the atmosphere or polluting water resources and natural resources, then they should be fined, and in some cases put in prison. But they should have a societal goal of not doing that. And in fact, there was a McKinsey study quite a few years ago now, which asked businesses if they thought climate change was a danger or an opportunity. And I think 80% of companies thought it was an opportunity. And so business can do good things. And yes, regulations have their limits. It would be much better if companies just decided to operate in a way that was ethical and was in the interest of their workers, communities, and the planet. Failing responsible business conduct and corporate social responsibility, sometimes we do need to intervene in that and to provide the right incentives, but also the right rules of the game if they do violate these things. And just to finish, Joe Stiglitz said once that we do need an invisible hand, the invisible hand of the market, but we also need a visible hand. And so it's not capitalism on its own. It's capitalism plus the appropriate level of state involvement.